The fact that you prevented this review from happening doesn't change the fact that it was going to happen. Let's talk about Minority Report.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are back, the Eye of the Storm podcast. So, Daniel, can you please let the people know what we're going to be discussing or debating today?
So this is Have You Seen, in which we talk about a movie that some of us know well and others have just seen for the first time. This week, we are talking about Minority Report, which is a 2002 science fiction movie about a world in the year 2054 in which a group of psychics have led to the existence of what is called precrime, in which they predict murders and the police then intercept the potential killer before they actually commit the crime. And murder and most violent crime has been eradicated from that area. The story follows one of the officers who work in pre-crime, and things get complicated when the precogs predict that this officer will commit a murder against somebody who he has never met and doesn't know who he is. And convinced of his own innocence, he begins to go on the run and investigate the murder he is about to commit, fully convinced that it is some kind of error, even though he is one of the truest believers in the system. And the plot then unravels from there. So what did we think of Minority Report?
Throughout this movie, it kind of made me feel like I was a bad person because even though the pre-crime police technically is a good thing, I still felt like it wasn't fair, especially in the beginning, which was mad because they arrested the guy for nearly killing his wife. So it was like, how could I, like me, the words coming out of my mouth saying that what they're doing to him is unfair. I was definitely engaged, mainly in the halfway mark. Before that, it was cool. Like, it was an interesting concept. So I'll say Act 1 definitely sucked me in. After that, I would probably say I was a bit like, I'll say, okay, it was cool because I was seeing a lot of it was mainly like Tom Cruise stuff, you know, the running, the fighting. I wasn't as engaged because it was in 2003. So like, the visuals weren't the best of the best. That being said, I think I liked how they used Tom Cruise's character. It gave a reason to make me care because, like I said, the loss of his son was the reason why he was so for pre-crime. And then to see from starting off as one of its biggest advocates to one of its biggest challengers, that was like a character development that wasn't rushed. It was actually pretty good. And I think the pinnacle moment for me was the setup and how that unraveled. I was like, oh, that was good when he ended up confronting his son's killer. So I was like, yeah, that is the build up to that was really, really good. So overall, it was a good experience.
My thoughts. Firstly, it kind of first reminded me of Mercy, which came out earlier this year. Not completely similar, but not too completely different in the sense of like there's this like similar system that kind of like prejudges, or in Mercy's case, anyways, is that you're guilty and you have like X amount of time to like prove that you're innocent. These two cops kind of find themselves in the same situation. Obviously, this is a better movie than what Mercy was at the top of the year, but that was kind of like my first thoughts going into when I was experiencing the movie. I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed kind of like the premise of it, the setup. I had you asking kind of like loads of questions. Again, like Jonathan said, kind of like question the morality of like certain things as well, whether it was completely right to sort of have the system or not. And I think by the end of the movie, it kind of gives its view or like answers it a little bit. I actually kind of think the movie was like maybe a little bit too long because there was definitely sections in this movie where I didn't think some of like the tension or some of like the drama that they were trying to build or like in some of the action scenes were completely necessary. Like, for example, when he has to replace his eye and he's in this place and then police officers kind of go after him in this apartment. I was like, I get it, whatever, but I was like, I kind of felt like we probably didn't need the extra action scene in that particular moment. Other areas it was fine and it was okay, but I think it just in that one scene, I also kind of think like some of the action scenes were a little bit unbelievable in the sense of you kind of have like this guy completely surrounded, but just somehow, some way, he kind of ends up with the upper hand in certain situations. Like I think there was one where he was like in the alley and they're kind of all around him basically, but he's kind of somehow managed to get away. So stuff like that kind of like annoyed me a little bit in the movie, but I didn't completely hate it, but it kind of annoyed me. And it was just like kind of like that one. I think there was like another example where I felt like the movie was just like kind of like dragging a little bit. But kind of overall, I think really sort of really good, really engaging movie. The twist was good. You could see it coming from a mile away. Who the actual bad guy was, you watch enough of these movies,
Yeah.
you kind of know how it's going to play out. But I feel like the way that they executed it and revealed it, again, like sort of what Jonathan saying about like, how they kind of tied in his like personal trauma into sort of what was going on and kind of like using that against him and stuff like that. I think helped kind of keep it engaging and stuff. Overall, I'm like positive in it. I wouldn't say it's like, the greatest movie of all time, but overall I'm positive in it. And And yeah, it was an enjoyable watch for the most part.
Just to add quickly to what you just said, that I do heavily agree with the action of the movie. For me, that kind of like took away from the film, because obviously there was such a philosophical setup, and I think they were very heavily like reliant, especially when it came to the final act, on like chase heavy scenes. And for me, like I said, it just kind of like took away the emotional aspect of things as well as the philosophical aspect of things. So it's like at times it kind of felt like two movies, and it didn't need to be. I think it could have just been like, with the Precrime, it already has a lot of drama in itself, so they could have concentrated on developing that, and yeah, have a scene here or there where, you know, it's chase and fight scenes because it's Tom Cruise, but still, like I said, they had such a great setup with the whole philosophical aspect. I think they could have just, you know, used that to provide the drama and the action in a way.
This movie comes from a time in which everybody just believed that you had to have action scenes and chases in your science fiction movie, otherwise people would not watch. While at the same time, these movies were constantly being criticized for this, right? So these movies often have about half an hour of really interesting setup where they introduce the world and the conflict and the big what if, and then there's an hour of running and shooting and yelling. Even back then, people would criticize it, but filmmakers would insist that this has to be there, otherwise people will just not watch. They will just not watch people engaging with a sci-fi concept for 2 hours. And I don't know that that's wrong exactly. Like, this movie made $350 million. It would not have been nearly as much if it hadn't been a Tom Cruise action movie. I guarantee it. But I do agree that the action gets a little bit samey. Like, you're kind of waiting for the story to continue a little bit, right? Like, I think that's absolutely there. But at the same time, there's really a lot of plot here, right? Where I remember in like 10th grade, we were supposed to present a movie we liked in class, and I presented Minority Report, and we spent an hour trying to understand the plot. And actually, the next lesson, the teacher came back and said, okay, I watched the movie. Here are my notes. Let's figure this out. And we couldn't do it because it was that complex. And like, watching it again, I think it's not that complicated, but I do think there's a lot of moving pieces here. And I do think if you pay close attention to it, it does all add up and it does all make sense, but you kind of have to go with the sequence, like the sequencing of the scenes, right? So for instance, when he goes to the scientist, the geneticist who created Precrime, right? Who kind of discovered that the precogs existed and then studied them and figured out that you could use this to predict murders. I don't know that she's established. It seems to me like Anderton just goes to her. There's little things here where you kind of just have to roll with like just characters being introduced, where there's not a whole lot of foreshadowing. But it seems to me like if these things were foreshadowed and properly established before they became relevant, the movie would be even more complex and even more convoluted and even longer. And it seems to me like it's already at the breaking point of how complex you can make a movie like this before it becomes too much.
Or I don't know if I watched this movie properly then, because I didn't feel it was complex, or I didn't feel like I was like lost at any point in the plot. I kind of like understood and was like following along well, unless you're going to tell me that there was like 101 things I was missing in the movie potentially.
So first of all, I was 16 when I was overwhelmed by this movie, right? So I think if I had to do this again now, I would maybe have slightly better chances. But you've got Precrime and how they operate. We've got the precogs and their rules. We've got the audit by Witwer. We have the prediction of Anderton's murder. There's the story of his son being kidnapped, which ties into the guy he's about to murder, right? Because that guy is being set up as the kidnapper so that Anderton commits a murder and is kind of off the board. And then we have the congressman, I think it is, who has his own conspiracy. And then there's this whole revenge scheme with the wife, and you've got the scientist, and you've got the whole surgery subplot. Like, there's a lot of moving pieces. And I do think it all adds up and it all feeds towards a relatively straightforward payoff and conclusion in which Anderton basically breaks the system that he believes in. But it's like a jigsaw puzzle. These pieces all have to be there. Otherwise, it's not quite the same story. Like you said earlier, there were some redundant sequences, and maybe the surgery scene is a little bit longer than it needs to be, or maybe the exposition scene with the geneticist doesn't have to be there or be quite as long, or could have been done differently. But 90% of it, I think, is really essential. And I think that is one of the reasons why this holds up so well, is because you have to pay attention to follow this plot, and the movie rewards you for paying attention and for following the plot, right? This is not just technobabble to sit through until the next action scene. The convoluted sci-fi nonsense is the plot, and it does set up this whole scenario of what even is justice. And without that, it would not be the same movie, I don't think.
I have one burning question. Just in kind of you kind of like talked about like the plot and everything like that, and all the moving pieces. Again, maybe there's a reason for it in the movie that I might have missed. But when like the red balls come down and it says like Lee Crow is meant to be murdered and is meant to be murdered by him. And it kind of turns out at the end of the movie that this guy was like in jail, I believe. He was in jail and they released him and they said like, we'll kind of like take care of your family. If you take the bullet, basically, we will look after your family, we'll pay your family. And obviously, at the time John Anderton doesn't know who Lee Crow is. Shouldn't it take kind of like a search or like some type of like looking up in the system to see, okay, Lee Crow was this person that was in jail, and you kind of start to pull the threads as to like why was he released and sort of why is he out on the street? Why did his like sentence get like reduced or something along the lines? I don't know. It just seemed like a massive plot hole of like we could have quickly found out that, especially someone that works in law enforcement, who Lee Crow was, to like start to pull at the strings and like start to uncover the mystery of him being set up.
I think if they were doing proper investigations, then they would have discovered inconsistencies in Crow's story. I think you're absolutely right about that. But everybody who works in Precrime has seen over and over that the precogs don't get it wrong. Like, if the red ball comes down, it means that Lee Crow is going to be murdered. He's going to be an innocent victim, and John Anderton is going to be the murderer. End of story. All they have to do is get to Anderton first before he commits the murder. That's their job. That's what they do. They're not set up to investigate at all. They're just essentially tracking people down, and like they're on call to track people down and intercept. That's police work in this world, and I think that's why they don't.
On their part, yeah, I get it. I just meant on John Anderson's part, because obviously he's like, I'm scheduled to kill this man. I don't even know who this man is. I get like after a certain point, like he's kind of like doesn't have access to the system. Although that's like another like red flag in this movie, where his biometrics still works to get into certain places. I think that's like maybe a bit of like an oversight, because I think if you're on the run, then they probably should lock you out of the system. But we'll give the movie a pass. But I don't know, I just felt like on his part, he could have, I don't know, looked before he ran, or when he had the opportunity, he could have like, or like asked someone that he had like a good relationship with to be like, can you figure out who this person is? And like that would then kind of like add to the uncovering of the mystery somehow.
I think he doesn't have time is the answer. So he's in the room when the precogs make their prediction, and then he starts running, and his first instinct is, I have to figure out what's broken with the precogs. So he goes to the scientist who studied them and trained them. And then from that point on, he's like, the police is always 5 minutes behind him. You're right, there could have been a scene where he sits down in a hotel room and just starts researching Lee Crow. Right? Like, who is this person I'm supposed to kill? That's absolutely right, but I don't think he ever has 5 minutes to actually do this.
Yeah, and I guess the movie does show that he's constantly like, especially with like the technology and like the eye scanning and stuff like that, is that they will always after a certain point kind of know your location and know your movements. So yeah, he was kind of like frantic and constantly like on the go. So, and
also considering how networked this world is and how much surveillance there is, I don't know that he can actually log in anywhere and not be immediately found by the police. I was going to bring this up later, where we're about halfway towards the future they're depicting here, right? Like, it's 50 years in the future and it was made 25 years ago, right? So we're at the halfway point. And a lot of the stuff that is in this movie that is predicted actually kind of came true. And I want to go through that in a little bit of detail. But like, if you're on the run, one of the things they will track is all your logins and all your accounts and all of that, right? And if you use any of them, they will immediately trace you. So I don't think he ever uses any of his personal accounts or a search engine or anything like that, because it would draw attention to him at that point. He's always hiding in some, dark alley or in the wilderness where it's easier to evade the sensors. I imagine that's the answer.
No, I was just going to say on the futuristic aspect of it as well. It's funny because you're right on the surveillance side of things, they definitely get it right. But I just kind of always find it funny how like in this world you kind of have like the road layouts is like super crazy and like the vehicles and stuff like that. And now that we live closer to the time or when the movie was kind of predicting, you kind of look at it and you're like, that never really made sense that like we would completely change the road structures or like how things are laid out to be like floating in the sky for like, it just doesn't logically make sense like now that you think about it. But I don't know, it feels like everything of that time and maybe before kind of predicted this like flying cars and like, I don't know, like these roads that like travel through the sky and stuff like that. And yeah, it probably solves some traffic issues that we have, but I don't know, it still seems like so far away from us being anywhere like, doing anything like that.
Science fiction always assumes that we will rebuild our cities for the new technology, and that's just not how it is, right? Like we just kind of staple the future on top of what already exists. Pretty much everywhere in the world, we're stuck with how things were when we modernized, right? And we live in London, right, where the streets are hundreds of years old, and we have like buildings that are 100 years old and somebody drilled a hole into it so that fiber optic cable can be laid, right? Like, that's like the past and the future or current technology kind of stapled together, but nobody's gonna bulldoze London to build a new one with a better layout. Let's say we have flying cars or self-driving cars or something, like some monumental technology. We're not gonna rebuild the city from scratch anywhere to accommodate that. So I think that is one of the areas that science fiction always gets wrong. But we do have self-driving cars, like they're in their infancy, but they work. And we have, like, everything is networked and everything is online. And we have, targeted ads that didn't exist 25 years ago, right? When Anderton goes into the shop to buy some clothes, like civilian clothes, there's an ad that knows what he usually buys, right? And everybody is seeing an ad that is AI generated for them, that knows their history and their preferences and what that person is most likely to buy. And we're like 80% of the way there, right? We've targeted ads, we have, AI, we have all these profiles on us, right? And thankfully, they're not that smart. Like, the recommendations I get are not that specific. Like, my favorite example is the time Google believed I was a collector of toilet seats because I bought one and then tried to sell me more for about 3 months. No, I just need the one, once per decade or something. Like, how does your system not realize what's a hobby and what's a one-off purchase, right? So it's not that smart, but like, they're trying. And that, I think, was something that wasn't really around in 2002.
I think ultimately, whilst it gets some things wrong, there actually is a scary level of like accuracy to kind of how the future has shaped. And then you have like all the talks of like controlling people's presence on social medias and VPN bans and on all of these things. So yeah, it's kind of scary how accurate it can be in certain aspects.
So they actually got a whole bunch of experts together back in 2002 and put them in a room for 3 days and said, predict the future. And the world building of this and the technologies and all of that essentially came out of like a report that they wrote. Basically, this is what we think the world will be like in 50 years. These are the emerging technologies and these are the big trends. And this is where we think this will go within 50 years. Everything about how, the city is laid out and how people live and what people have in terms of tools and toys and technology came out of that, essentially. And I think there's very little in it that is just outright wrong. A lot of the time, when you look at like old sci-fi predictions, they will have things where they take the current big thing and then extrapolate it, right? Like 100 years ago, people wrote science fiction about how everything was nuclear, including your watch, because nuclear power was the big thing. And today, everything is AI, but we won't actually know what it will be in 50 years, right? So that is one of the kind of the big weaknesses of science fiction a lot of the time, if it's about actually predicting and imagining a plausible future, where people can rarely look beyond, the next 10 minutes. But I think this one got it mostly right, and at least in the big picture. And that ironically makes it really dated because it looks like pretty much any sci-fi movie from the last 20 years, right? Like the cars and the fashion and the architecture and how like the holographic displays and all of that. And that's actually one of my questions. If you watch it for the first time in 2026, does it look old-fashioned?
I wouldn't say it looks old-fashioned. Obviously, it's an older movie, but I think, like you said, there was like elements of it where you could kind of just like recognize modern day in the movie, and you're like, oh, it doesn't really feel out of place. But I don't know, Jonathan, how do you feel about it?
If I was to watch the film without knowing when it came out, I would be able to tell that it was an older movie in comparison to the newer ones. As well as the CGI. You know what? I would commend that, to be fair, because it did come out quite a long time ago, and it looked in comparison to the stuff that you see now, it's pretty much on par.
Yeah, I don't know. Like to me, a lot of the sci-fi stuff is kind of dated because, for example, the holographic displays, like that's just what the future looks like and has looked like for the last 10 years, to the point where it's obligatory. I think in that way, it comes across as a little bit backwards. If you watch it today, I think that's how I would see it. So one of the things that I think really makes this movie is how tight the script is. So we spent about 30 minutes setting everything up, right? So everything from Anderton and his history, the precogs and precrime and how it all works and what's at stake and what the assumptions are that characters have living in this world, right? And then at the 30-minute mark, we get the red ball that frames Anderton for the murder. And from that point on, we don't have to introduce much else. We do get more background stuff, like the geneticist, Heinemann, introduces the idea of the minority report, right? This idea that sometimes the precogs don't agree, which throws the whole thing out of the window, right? Like if the precogs don't agree, then this whole certainty that people have about how this is definitely going to happen and this whole philosophical underpinning of precrime is immediately out of the window, which is why they've been hiding it. But by the 30-minute mark, when the action starts, we know who everybody is. we know what's at stake, we know what the rules are, and they don't get broken, and they get only slightly amended from that point on, right? I don't think there's a huge exposition dump after this. And I think that's one of the reasons for why this works so well and why this can be so plotty, because after the initial 30 minutes, we don't have to stop the movie to explain things anymore. Like, Anderson still finds things out, but their details or their complications of what has already been established. And I think that's a huge part of why this works.
Wait, question. When you say the precog team was pretty much in disagreement, are you referring to Colin Farrell's character?
No, the precogs. This whole thing about the Minority Reports, that they don't always see the same future. And the system intentionally hides the Minority Report.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the whole plot, right? Like that Anderton wants to find his Minority Report. Because if there's evidence that at least one of the precogs saw a future in which he didn't kill Crow, then his conviction is no longer a sure thing, right? And then he finds out that doesn't exist, that in fact all three saw that future. But in the meantime, he has found out that Minority Reports exist and they're being systematically hidden by the system in order to justify itself.
I definitely understand what you mean. But question, with the Minority Report, didn't they say murder doesn't exist in that place due to pre-crime? Because when they said that, I was thinking, well, if murder doesn't exist, then what is the actual point of pre-crime? But then
people still commit murders, and the precogs predict them, and the police stop the murderer. And so premeditated murder is gone because the kinds of people who are planning to kill people have just stopped. They will just not do that because they know they will get caught. And so the only murders that still happen are crimes of passion, where somebody goes from zero to murder within minutes. That is what the precogs detect, and that is what the police stop. But nobody has successfully killed anybody in the Washington area where this program is running in years.
Do I have a question on that? Because if they're like premeditating, if they're catching premeditated murder, then there's some level of like planning there, and you can kind of like foresee that. I feel like I have like a slight issue that they're able to detect crimes of passion.
Well, they say that it's harder and there's less notice. Basically, if I want to kill somebody for I don't know, for money, I'm gonna spend weeks planning it, right? And that sends a stronger and clearer signal to the precogs, and that makes it easy for them to detect. And then once I know that pre-crime exists, I'm gonna just not do that. I'm gonna try to commit some other crime that doesn't trigger the precogs. Whereas if I'm like a jealous husband and within minutes I'm just flying to a jealous rage, that sends out a very strong but short notice signal to the precogs. And so either way the precogs detect it, but the crimes of passion, first of all, crimes of passions are not planned, right? So the existent, like deterrence doesn't work on crimes of passion in any context, right? Secondly, it's more volatile, and so the police has to respond in very short notice. Like, that's the difference.
Yeah, it's just that element of like the signal for it is like a little bit later and it's a little bit stronger. But and I guess the example that they showed us was it happening that morning, and they had to kind of like rush and get there that morning. But I don't know, it just seems like there's like an element of, because they're precog, they get premonitions of like what's to come, and they might get like an intense signal or whatever. I don't know. There's just like an element of that just kind of doesn't completely sit right with me, even though like I understand the movie's explanations of like it takes a little bit sort of less notice, and like, you know, you have less time to kind of react to it, etc. But I don't know. There's just something that's not 100% all the way there with me for that.
I mean, obviously it's constructed to make a good story, right? The movie selects a time frame to enable an exciting chase scene, right? Like, enables this heated investigation scene, and then they have like 8 minutes to fly the helicopter to that place to wrestle the knife out of the guy's hand, right? Like, obviously it's constructed to enable that moment. But I think it makes sense. Like, there's nothing about this that's contradictory, I don't think.
Yeah, maybe not contradictory. Would I see like someone being able to predict something that's just going to happen off the fly is kind of the thing. But again, it's not like a massive thing, and it's not like I was like watching the movie, like I saw it and I completely hated it. It was more that we were just kind of like talking about it, and I kind of like thought about it a little bit, and I was like, I don't hate it. It doesn't like completely break the movie, because again, like you said, there's an explanation for it and it makes sense. It's a bit hokey, but I'll allow it.
I mean, it was always going to have happened, right? Like, this is the kind of thing where you have to invent new tenses to express the idea. So I think it checks out. Like, I don't think there's anything in that setup where I say, okay, this is clearly contrived. I don't think. I think it's very transparent as to why it's there, but it's supposed to imagine a world in which that kind of justice exists, right? Like any world building decision, any writing decision, you select the pieces in order to enable the story you want to tell, right? And here the story is about people are really, really sure about pre-crime working, and they're seeing the evidence all over the place. Like crime rates are down to zero, basically, because it's had that much of an impact. They have this elaborate philosophical argument for why this is justice. And that is ultimately what the movie is about, right? Like they are convicting people of crimes that have not been committed because they are metaphysically certain. Like one thing I like about this is that there's this whole scene where Witwer, the guy from the Department of Justice who's auditing pre-crime, he's not convinced by it and he's kicking the tires. And every objection he has is reasonable, and every answer he gets is also reasonable, I think. The movie didn't really sell me on the idea that precogs are real, because they're not, but it sold me on the idea that these people really believe in their work. And they're not just paid off, they're not just true believers, they have seen this work over and over again. And so they're trying to convince the rest of the world that this is a good idea because it saves lives. Nobody is lying when they argue for pre-crime, I don't think. Like outside of Burgess, right? Because he knows the whole story and he knows all the limitations, he knows about the Minority Reports, and he knows how to how to get away with murder in the system. But everybody else has ample reason to believe in this, including Anderton, right? Like Anderton is the biggest believer in this. When he gets accused of a crime, he knows he's not going to commit or doesn't believe he would ever commit. And that is kind of the internal conflict in this. And like the entire rule set about who the precogs are and how they work and how pre-crime works and all of that is just there to enable the internal conflict in Anderton, where on the one hand, he truly believes in the system and he truly believes this is making the world a better place. But then he also truly believes that he would not do what the precogs say he's going to do. And that is a conflict. And he has to figure this out internally. That drives this movie, and that is why it's a good movie. It's not just about like the bad guy, although those exist too. But the crux of this is the internal conflict, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Another aspect of this is the idea of predestination versus free will, right? Like that's kind of leans into this as well. And usually like in discussions of this movie, this is kind of the big topic that people talk about. We've all heard of like the free will debate, and do people have free will, or are we just doing what we would have done anyway and all of that, right? Does this movie do anything interesting with that, and do you think?
It kind of ties into like a little bit more of like the morality side of things. Like when you have like that big moment at the end where, you know, it's kind of been pre-seen that he will kill that man and he chooses not to. My immediate thought didn't go to like the free will debate. It kind of turned into like the morality of like, did you give everyone else that same choice? And it's like, I think there was like a nice line in there of like, if you knew your future, would you do anything like a little bit differently, etc. Which I think then kind of also ties into like free will versus like the predetermined things. Like, you know, if this was your destiny, would you change it, or would you just kind of follow the path that you're heading down? But I was like more thinking of like the moral side of it, of like, you know, especially because you like the movie does show like how people are like locked up, and I think it's in this not tube thing, but I know it seems like they're just like sedated in this prison, and they like have no ability to do anything anymore. You've put away all of these people because it was determined that they might kill this person. Not that they have, but they were likely going to, or they may have. And it's almost like, does the punishment fit the crime? Is there any way that they could have like handled it differently? And again, like you kind of understand it from like the movie's perspective, because you can't like have the police there and like hold them back up until the point where someone has been killed, and then you kind of step in because it kind of like defeats the purpose. They have to like get there first. But it's just, I don't know, similar to what happened with John Anderton in this is, are you able to get to the person first and say, this is what's been seen, or I don't even know, but like just kind of giving them the choice, and like the options kind of like change the destiny. I just kind of came away like a little bit more empathetic for like everyone that had been locked up before, because they didn't have that final choice in like the really like key moment. They didn't have the choice to be like, it's like the husband outside the movie. He didn't have a choice to be like, I'm not going to do this for like my daughter's sake or his kid's sake or whatever.
But at that point, he has the scissors in his hands and he's swinging it at his wife, right? It's not like they go, oh, in 3 days, you will kill your wife, you're under arrest, right? That's not what's happening. That's probably what happened with the premeditated cases when they were still happening. And I wonder if those people got a choice. But with the crimes of passion, there's like margins of minutes. And usually the crime or the attack is in progress when the police get there, at least in the cases that we see. I don't think we see a case where somebody is just stopped in the street and they're arrested for a murder they're going to commit that evening, right? It's not like that. But I do agree with you that the justice and morality angle is much more interesting than the free will angle. I never thought free will as a concept was all that interesting because I don't find those discussions very productive, and I don't find those terms very clearly defined in a useful way. Like every time, like I've spent hours trying to make sense of the concept of free will, and it never quite makes sense. A large reason for that is that you only get one future, right? You don't get do-overs where you can see, okay, if I'm put into this situation 5 times, will I do the same thing 5 times? And that way you could demonstrate free will. Like it seems to me like you can never get to that point. And so arguments about it ultimately aren't all that interesting. But here we are shown a world in which the justice system is predicated on the idea that there isn't free will, right? That these people are not likely to commit a murder, they're going to commit a murder. There's this interesting scene where Witwer is in the Precrime office, and they have this red ball and they kind of roll it across the table. It falls off the edge or something like that, and somebody catches it before it hits the floor, and they say, would it have hit the floor? And Witwer says yes. And they say, but it didn't. I stopped it from hitting the floor, right? Which kind of is the argument that they know this is going to happen, and it would have happened even though they stopped it, and legally that is the same thing, right? Like the culpability is the same. It's a bit like attempted murder versus murder, kind of, where if you try to kill somebody and you fail, you're still at the intention, you still took those actions, right? You don't have to succeed in order to be guilty of something. And maybe that's like a little detail where if this was real, all these people would be booked for attempted murder or something like that, or they would invent a new category that's kind of like that. I don't know. But like this idea, like the system has very good reasons for firmly believing that this would have happened and was going to happen, and not just could have happened. And the cost of getting this wrong, the cost of backing off and saying, look, nobody's actually been killed yet, we have no case, and then people get killed and you could have stopped it, not only once but hundreds and hundreds of times each year. Imagine the weight of that, right? Imagine you're a politician trying to come up with laws and frameworks for how to use this power, and the cost of getting this wrong might mean that hundreds of people die every year because you were too high-minded. Like that's not right either, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's like that like strong dilemma of like, what do you do? And obviously the mass public would rather there be no murderers on the streets and sort of not care about like the other aspect of it as well, in terms of like, what happens to the murderer. Not until it's them in that situation. People kind of like rarely sort of empathize, put themselves in certain contexts until it actually happens to them. So like, to them it's like, oh, it's just like another murderer that's off the street. And you can also kind of like tie it to the precogs as well, because to the general public, they probably don't understand what is happening to the precogs and like maybe how they're suffering, or like what kind of like trauma that they're going through. They just know that there's like these 3 humans that have like enhanced ability to see the future. And as long as it's preventing crime, there's not really like a question as to like what's happening to the precogs, or like who they are, and like, what do they want, and like whether it's like ethical, or whether it's like right for them to kind of just be in this tub in like this like sleep state for the whole time.
And spending your entire working hours witnessing other people's murders. Imagine what that does to your head.
Yeah, exactly. But again, it's that morality of like, it's almost like out of sight, out of mind. Like everyone in society is benefiting, even down to like the sort of police officers that work at Precrime, where they hadn't ever interacted directly with the precogs. They just like never went down until like the auditor decided that he wanted to go down, and he had like the warrant to like actually go and see. They just kind of treated them like as part of the system, without really like any empathy for what it was doing to them, or like what they may have been experiencing when it's like that. So again, you kind of like hold a sort of mirror up to people. It's like, as long as you're benefiting, what are you willing to like look past, and what are you willing to like, not even like look past, because I don't think people are probably aware, but like not think about and not have on your mind, as long as you're all cushy and all good.
Yeah, but what I like about this is that all sides of this are justified, right? Like there's a reason for why the precogs are so valuable, and like it's not like there's an alternative. If they say no, if they even can, right? Like they've experienced this all their life, are they even able to just function in society, right? At the same time, you're locking innocent people up and are traumatizing them in order to save hundreds of lives every year. Outside of Burgess, there's no villains here, right? Like it's all just people saying, okay, we find ourselves in this situation, murders happen, we have a way to stop it. And it's not nice. We have to twist our idea of morality and of justice in order to do it, but there's a very clear benefit to it, and this benefit is so large that we can't just walk away from it. And you're right that the precogs are kept separate from everybody else. It's not like people are looking the precogs in the eye and are seeing what these experiences do to them. But at the same time, it's probably a good thing, because being around too many people probably messes their brains up as well, because they're still psychic. I think when Anderton brings Agatha into this underground facility, right, where they're doing these VR games in order to extract kind of these minority reports from her brain, she looks at one guy and just sees his future. Given that is happening, these people should be isolated for their own protection, right? But then isolating somebody for their entire life messes them up as well. So there's no clean and easy answers in this. And I think it is very telling that the system has to really pave over some cracks in order to make it seem as neat and tidy as they say it is, right? Even just the fact that like the minority reports are not public knowledge. Everybody presents this to the politicians and to the judges as this is going to happen. And like our psychics agree that this is going to happen, and they've been right for the last 500 times this has happened, right? And then the question is, like, there's this tribunal, right, like where Precrime presents the evidence to judges, and the judges then issue the warrant, right? And there's some open questions about who gets to be on that panel. How skeptical of Precrime can you be as a judge and still get selected for this job? What happens if you dissent? Can you even assess the evidence in like the 2 minutes, knowing that every minute you think about this takes 1 minute away from the police trying to save the victim? Like, it's all very constructed to be a slam dunk and beyond reproach. And then when Anderton kind of kicks the tires, even just a little bit, he immediately finds the cracks in it. I think that's very telling that everybody tries very hard to make this seem as easy as possible, because everybody is afraid of what conversations you have to have when you put all the cards on the table and don't just hide half of them. Did Precrime seem just and fair and true to you kind of in the beginning of the movie when they explain all of this, and then at the end when we know the whole picture? Should Precrime have been abolished in the end? Because that's what happens, right? Knowing that this means people will start getting murdered again.
At first, I don't think precog should have been banned. I just think it should have been used differently. So it could have been used as a reform tactic, where they, of course, like, they've seen that someone's about to commit a crime, arrest them, and then try and reform them, and then bring them back out in society. And then if again they see that they were about to commit a crime again, then they can use that as justification for arresting them and sending them to prison for an amount of time, a long time, whatever.
It's kind of like my thing, because you said to not abolish it at all, but to kind of like use it a little bit more responsibly. But if I think back at the start of the movie, I think I, from the get-go, had like empathy for the precogs. I was like, these are just people in like a tub. And it was clear that they weren't like, I wouldn't say, well, it was clear that they weren't willing participants in this. They weren't doing it because they had like this like higher power, and that they wanted to just like, use their power to help prevent crime from happening or murders. So that was like my feeling at the top of the movie. I don't think that went away. And of course, like, the unintended consequences are that there are murders that occur, like there's like crime that occurs, but at the expense of these people. And then what happens when the precogs eventually die? Because they are humans at the end of the day, and all humans have like a finite amount of time on this planet. So, we use the precogs up until they're not strong enough to be able to do it anymore. And then what's the alternative? Are you then forcing more people to become precogs, or like trying to like refine the formula so that you can get more stronger precogs? Or does the program completely sort of die with the precogs that also die at the end of their life? Because like they were like planning to like roll out nationally, and I don't know whether there was like mentioned like a plan of like what happens when these precogs die, like what happens with sort of the next phase. Let's just say that they were to die in like 50 years, 60 years. You kind of just confine them to this pool of like seeing murders happening over and over again as their life, all in the name of like stopping people from dying. And then once they're gone, people start being murdered all over again. So I would just say scrap it and let people live out their life.
And the first set of precogs were an accident, right? I think it was a side effect of the first batch of this street drug, right? That had this massive side effect. But if you want more precogs, you have to make them on purpose. And you probably have to grow them from birth, right? It's not like people can sign up to be precogs. So that's a whole nother ethical can of worms. Are you creating like a slave caste of psychics that make sure your society doesn't have murder anymore and maybe other severe crimes, but you have this underclass of people who are locked in a box living through murders for their entire lives, right? Like the first time it's an accident and you're kind of making the best out of an accident. If you make more, you're doing it on purpose, right? And you are now responsible for your choices.
No, I agree with what you guys are saying, especially like the whole thing about making the precog slaves. I'm just basing my argument on Anderson's character because remember his reasoning is backed by grief. So I'm just imagining myself in that situation. Okay, if I'm feeling grief due to the loss of my son based on crime and based on murder, and then I have a way to stop this, do I really want to give this system up that could prevent other people from feeling the same loss that I'm feeling? Even, God forbid, even if I was to experience that grief, I wouldn't want to hold people against their own will and turn them, as you lot say, like slaves 100%. But just based in movie context, have every right to what's the term? Something about for the greater will or something like that.
Greater good.
Yes, for the greater good. So in that type of situation, it would have to be for the greater good.
We're now witnessing your villain origin moment because you're justifying horrible things for the greater good.
Like I said, based on the main character's grief. If it was my own grief in real life, I would not do it.
It's clear that Anderton wants this to be real, right? Because he wants nobody else to go through this. But I think that only speaks to, like, gives credit to how well this is constructed, that we can have these debates and it's not clear. Like, if you just say, oh, this is cruel, shut it down, people start dying again, is it worth it? If we say keep it going, you are engaging in shady things as well, right? And that's even before you do things like hide minority reports and all of that. In that context, is Burgess a good villain? So the pre-crime director who turns out that he is rigging the entire system so that he could get away with murder, and he set up Anderton to kind of take him off the board so that he can operate with impunity. Is that a good character in a movie like this? What was your reaction when that was revealed? Did you say, oh, screw you, movie, you're cheating? Or are you saying, oh, this is cool?
No, it was predictable. That part was predictable. The part that wasn't predictable for me was the whole setup with the son and the crow guy. That wasn't predictable. But it made sense because obviously that was never his intention. It just got to the point where Anderson just got a bit too. Oh wait, no, it was his intention. Apologies, it wasn't because Anderson got nosy.
Yeah, the whole thing was premeditated. He's rigging the system where he figured out, like, there's this whole thing about the echoes, right? Where sometimes precogs see the same murder multiple times. And he figured out that if you murder somebody in a way that matches a previous murder, or if you stage a murder and then you commit the real murder, then the system will think it's an echo and not investigate. And that's how he can get away with murder.
Yeah, I know he rigged the system through that, but in terms of why set up Anderson, that's the part that I forgot. I was thinking to myself, he only did that because Anderson was getting too nosy, but that's not the case. He did that way before, like everything was all planned. But wait a second. But what was his reasoning again for setting up Anderson? Because no one was no one knew that he committed murder. Was it no? So that it was because Anderson was getting nosy, wasn't it? Because the whole Anderson being shown by the precogs was after he was looking into one of the murder victims who had no minority report.
I'm trying to find the bit in the plot synopsis.
He was shown the murder by, I think it's Amanda, I can't remember what her name is. He was shown the murder by that precog, and then he wanted to like look into it a little bit further. And I think he like dug into the files and then like realized some stuff was missing, etc. And then obviously I think the villain in this kind of saw that he was poking around, didn't really get any answers and wasn't going to like really put into him, but it was more of a case of he's done enough poking around. He's opened up some type of can of worms, and before it gets into anything serious, let's just take him off the board.
And Anderton was kind of on the trail that would have led him to Burgess, and that's when he gets framed in order to remove him.
Yeah, so the end, it did make sense. It was predictable, but obviously it did make sense. So I don't think it was a cheap way out. I think it was justified.
I'm just asking because the entire movie is like this complicated setup about morality and justice and fairness and choice and all of that. And then we have a guy who's just a criminal, who's just evil. And I don't know, like every time I watch this movie, I'm a little bit like, is this what this should all build to? Or should there be some kind of big like should Anderton be faced with this idea of I now have information that shows that Precrime is not nearly as, like, it's still useful, but it's not nearly as simple as people are saying it is, and have the evidence to prove it. But if I make this public, that might tank the entire project. But I believe in the project, right? That internal conflict would be more interesting. And I wonder if this is just a Hollywood thing where they have to bring it down to like a mustache twirling villain, right? And they hire like a German guy to do it as well, so he's evil and all of that.
I thought like the final like dilemma that he had was quite interesting because again like he was like very heavily invested in this precog program that he was running and obviously like had chosen not to step away, etc. And in his final moments he was kind of like posed with the dilemma of you either kill me and you show that precog actually works, or you don't kill me. Or I can't remember what that like, but there was just like an interesting like moment for him to decide what the future of the program should be, and then he kind of like chose to shoot himself.
So it was like you either kill me and something about you commit murder and your life is ruined, or you don't kill me.
And then the system you believe in falls apart.
Just in that moment where he's kind of like this is like his life's work basically. I think Jonathan, you were saying about like the lines in there that kind of like describe his conflict, but it was just like in that particular moment where it was make or break for this program and he chose to shoot himself.
So there's a theory about the ending because I think if you look at the last 15 minutes, it does feel a little bit different, right? In terms of its pacing and how it's shot and all of that, right? Before I go into the details of the theory, when you watched the ending, did you feel like it belonged in the same movie, or did it seem like a style break?
I didn't feel anything directly while watching it, but Jonathan, what do you say?
I don't think so. You know what? It's weird because it did kind of feel like it didn't feel like it should have been part of the film, but it made sense for it to be part of the film. It feels very I don't know if that opinion makes sense. It's weird because it kind of feels like my opinion I made back in terms of like the whole action heavy scenes and the philosophical setup of the film. It felt like two different movies. So with the whole him shooting himself, it felt like it was a part of the action heavy scenes, if that makes sense. And you know what I'm saying, separate from the actual film, but at the same time it was still a necessary part of the film because the philosophical drama and the action heavy drama, it felt like two different movies. Like I said, it did kind of take away from the film, but overall it's not really a bad thing because it didn't take away to the point of the film where I wasn't interested anymore. So just with the ending, sorry, just to go back on that, I felt like it was a necessity, but it didn't feel like it followed the tone of the film.
The theory basically is that Anderton gets captured and he gets put into like this VR sleep, right? Where he's sedated, and that as he goes under, the technician tells him that he's going to experience like a virtual reality created by his brain, and he will show him things he wants to see. So basically, you're not being tortured. You are kind of living out like kind of a paradise afterlife kind of thing while you are in this suspension, which, is very convenient, right? For the ethics of it all. But the next thing that happens is that his wife breaks into the facility and frees him at gunpoint, and they then confront the villain, who just validates everything Anderton says and stands for, and then he kills himself, and then the precogs are set free and get to live out the rest of their lives in a secluded cottage, and Anderton gets back with his wife, and in the epilogue she's shown to be pregnant, meaning they are getting a do-over on the loss of their son. And that's the end. Now, the theory goes that everything that happens in that sequence is a dream, where Anderton basically imagines his happy ending. But really, he's rotting in like a cryocell, and he will never get justice. Burgess will get away with it. And the system will just continue the way it has been. So it doesn't sound like that was your theory, like you share that theory.
I think it follows though. It follows, like I said, the tone, and it follows kind of like it follows everything of the film: the feel, the tone, the subject matter, and it feels more realistic. I actually would have preferred that ending, even though it was way more darker. But I would have preferred that ending.
It is a dark ending, but does it make sense, like thematically? Like, is that a good ending to the story?
I feel like it will make it into a film in one rather than in two. Because, like I said, already the film already feels like it's separate. But this, I think, with that ending there, it makes it whole. But it does follow onto the theme, in my opinion.
I generally don't like dreams, right? Like dream endings, or where what we're seeing is not really real. But I do think it if this was the intended ending, I think it would support kind of the basic theme of the movie, which is that there's no real justice. There's just like people are being railroaded into certain events through the existence of the precogs, and nobody really has a choice anymore in terms of what they're doing or how things turn out, because everything is kind of being predetermined by what the precogs see, and people then execute on that as opposed to what's real justice. Anderton doesn't get any justice because the system precludes it from happening, which is the same thing that happened to everybody Anderton has ever put away. They don't get thought out for a day in court, right? They get convicted before they've even done anything. They will never get an appeal. They will never get a second chance. They will never get to defend themselves, right? And the same thing happens to Anderton. And that is a consequence of his need to believe in the system and to continue to kind of support it even after he knows how flawed it is. And then by the time he realizes how flawed it is, there's no way out, right? Like because he has helped build a system that doesn't give you a second chance. And therefore he doesn't get one. And the alternative is kind of this James Bond nonsense of breaking into the party and confronting the villain, and everything works out perfectly. So the more I think about it, I might actually like the dream scenario, because it's kind of like a tragic ending for Anderton, and it's kind of like a punishment for his willingness to cut corners in justice and morality, and now he has to sleep in the bed that he's helped made.
Yeah, because it definitely does also, like with that ending, it definitely does add to the, like you said, the terrifying realization that your own reality is kind of like constructed by others. It kind of forces people to live robotically. They're operating based on how society is constructed, and obviously that's based on the system, and clearly the system runs their life. So yeah, like I said, like their reality is not their own, and that ending would have added to the whole, my life is not mine.
It seems to me like nobody is actually afraid of precrime, right? It's not like people are changing the way they behave because they know precrime exists, right? I don't think I saw that in any scene.
Maybe not the whole of society, but like a demographic of people should felt that way, don't you think?
Or people get really cagey once an argument starts.
Yeah.
Right? Because they don't know, like the police might break through the window at any moment and tell you were about to kill somebody, and you have no way to stop it, even though you at the moment you weren't planning it, right? Like there's nothing like this, right? It's not like people are getting into an argument and it gets a little bit heated and people back off immediately and look over their shoulder and wait for the police to burst through the door, and then they don't come. I don't know, like maybe that should have been in this movie, because this is like a big thing, right? Like this is the kind of thing that informs how people interact, right?
No, definitely, I agree. Like I'm saying, society would have felt like prison in a way, like constant eyes on you, and that's exactly the type of world I believe that the existence of precogs creates.
It's a little bit like, I've not really been in this situation, but every time I'm in an argument with somebody in public, part of me is looking out for people pulling out their phones. And if they did, I would back off immediately, because there's no way you're winning that, right? Like if people shows like a snippet of an argument you have in public and then post it on social media, you're done. You know what I mean? Like you can only lose that, because they will show the part that makes you look the worst, even though in context you might have been right or nothing bad happened or whatever. And it seems to me like precrime would be the equivalent of this, where people just know if it gets close to getting passionate or heated or something, you immediately back off. Or if you see the police, you go the other way, no matter what, right? Like little things like this. So this just occurred to me. Maybe that's with the one flaw in this movie, that it doesn't show how it changes the behavior in people who were never going to be arrested for anything, but everybody thinks they could be at any moment. Yeah, I think that's maybe a flaw in this. Like they spend so much time figuring out the fashion and the technology and all of that, but they didn't really go into the psychology of how do you behave in a world in which you can be arrested for a crime you didn't commit, or the system believes you will commit, even though you never might, but it would still change your behavior for the rest of your life. That sort of thing. That's actually a big flaw. Now I'm actually getting down on the movie a little bit for not doing this. Actually, this is one scene, right? Like in the hollow parlor thing, when the guy figures out that he's talking to a precog, he says something like, "That thing you're seeing, I wasn't going to do that," or something like that, right? He can see that he has maybe thought about committing a crime, and now she sees him committing it, and if she accuses him of it, he's done. So that's the one time, right? But what I'm looking for is like just everyday people, like somebody bumps into somebody on the train, and everybody's terrified of being accused of a crime they were going to commit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no. This system, it forces you to operate. Like when, even like with tests, I could be good at something, but the fact that I know that I'm going to be assessed on something, that could cause me to act differently. So even though I know that I perform really well in this specific task, but it could cause me to just not perform well at all at the task due to the fact that pressure, eyes, etc., etc. So this is pretty much the same thing.
Which changes your behavior that you're being assessed on, right? Like the test in this example is changing the outcome of what it is trying to measure. Similarly, precrime, just by existing, changes the behavior of the people it is supposed to deliver justice for.
Yeah.
So it's an active participant in justice as opposed to like an arbiter, like the way our justice system is. Kind of. That's just like all. It's like we can go down a rabbit hole if you really wanted to kick the tires on that idea. But in this world, it's the justice system is much more active than it is in ours in that sense, right?
Yeah.
All right, we're getting on in time. Any other thoughts on Minority Report?
Overall, I like the film.
So the usual question is, does this go on the shelf? Does this have the reputation it has for good reason? Is this something to go back to? Is this something to show other people? Or is this like a pretty decent movie from 24 years ago, but that's it?
For me, I would say it goes on the shelf only because it invokes a question, similar to the drama, even though the drama was a more enjoyable watch. But I think if it didn't invoke that question about of pre-crime, I'm saying what pre-crime does and stuff, then I don't think it would have gone on the shelf. Because in terms of like, everything else, like the drama and stuff and the action, all of that, it was good. Don't get me wrong, but it wasn't great. It wasn't like the greatest. So it wouldn't be something that I would call a classic. But when a movie, like I said, invokes a question to me, I'm like, it just sticks with me. So this one, I would have gone on the shelf because I would have shown other people, and then I would have wanted to have a conversation with them afterwards in terms of like a debate in terms of, the morality of things. I would say it's gone on the shelf due to that.
Does the fact I asked this question change the outcome of whether or not you will show this to somebody?
To be fair though, I've already mentioned this to someone. So yeah.
All right, Hervé, does this go on the shelf?
I would say so, yeah. I think it's actually probably more enjoyable than I said at the top. And it is one that you can kind of put on around other people as well. If you're kind of like lacking of things to watch and you just want to kind of put on something that's like, that will be good and that will get like people like thinking and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that for that reason, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think this is a top tier movie. Like it looks like a proper movie. It's grand. It's well acted. I think it's high quality. I think especially after having seen Disclosure Day just a few weeks ago and being really disappointed with Steven Spielberg, watching this again right after that, basically, I was reminded of why this Disclosure Day was so disappointing, because this is what Spielberg looks like when he's good, right? Like it's just so well crafted. It's so tight. The script, the characters, the action is a little bit on the generic side. It's a lot of running. It's a lot of chases. I do find the six sticks funny, but that's about it. But leaving aside the slightly generic action, everything about this, the plot, the characters, the scenario, the big what ifs, it all works. I think it's top tier Hollywood sci-fi, in my opinion. So yeah, this is absolutely something I revisit every few years, and I never regret it. It doesn't get old.
Okay, well guys, thank you very much for tuning into today's discussion.
If you reach this part of the episode, as always, we appreciate you pressing play and checking us out. And as always, if you liked what you had today, you should probably tell a friend. And if you hated everything, you should probably tell an enemy. We are the Eye of the Storm podcast.
All right, guys, we'll catch you next time. Au revoir.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.